During the 1998 season, there was a certain rule currently in place that could have been easily manipulated to favor certain teams. The rule stated that, quote, teams that lost players to Group 3 unrestricted free agency would be eligible to receive a compensatory draft pick, and teams would be given a higher draft pick based off the team's payroll. Smaller markets would get high picks, medium-sized markets would get lower picks, and big market teams barely got anything at all. The Nashville Predators were the new team on the block and were prepared to begin the expansion draft when the front office recognized that they could use this rule to their advantage. One of the unprotected players who was set to become a UFA that offseason was Rangers goaltender Mike Richter, and the Predators knew that if they were to select him and let the Rangers re-sign him, being in a smaller market, they could get a pretty good pick as compensation. So that's exactly what the Predators would do. They would select Richter with the third pick and simply didn't offer him a contract, resulting in the Rangers doing exactly what Nashville expected them to do. Nashville would receive a second round pick and walked away looking like geniuses. So fast forward a couple years later to 2002, and the Predators, knowing how well they did with the Richter situation, decided to take advantage of the loophole once again. They would trade for Stars goaltender Ed Belfour and allowed the Stars to re-sign him after acquiring him. The Predators would once again gain back a second round pick, and they would use that pick to select none other than defenseman Shea Weber. So thanks to the success they had from selecting Richter in the expansion draft, they used the same method to later end up getting a franchise defenseman. Since the hype for Seattle is at an all-time high and controversy has already begun erupting due to protection lists, I wanted to do something special. I didn't want to create a mock draft this year, as let's be honest, about 95% of my picks would be wrong, so instead I wanted to look back on expansion drafts of the past and look back on some of their most strangest moments. Nashville isn't the only team in today's video to take advantage of a loophole, as the Chicago Blackhawks were able to secure a franchise great thanks to one player in particular. When the WHA merged with the NHL in 1979, it was historic, but also extremely messy. The league gained 4 new teams in the Nordiques, Jets, Whalers, and Oilers, but the NHL insisted that the teams be known as expansion teams rather than merger teams. Because of this, the NHL teams would be able to reclaim the players they lost to the WHA. Over 100 players defected to the new league when the league was founded in 1971, and some of the WHA teams entering the NHL wanted to keep certain players. So they had to do what NHL teams were able to do at Vegas and will be doing with Seattle: make deals. One of the teams that made a deal was the Quebec Nordiques, as they wanted to hold on to their star forward, Real Cloutier. Chicago wanted to reclaim Cloutier as he was the most intriguing player not on Quebec's protection list, while in the WHA, Cloutier was 4th all-time in league history in points with 566 points in 369 games, even having an 141-point season in the 76-77 season. So that's understandable, but Quebec would give Chicago a first-round pick in exchange for them not taking Cloutier. Once every NHL team would take back their players, the expansion draft would commence for the 4 new teams. And once the season was over, the Quebec Nordiques were one of the worst teams in the league, resulting in their pick becoming the 3rd overall selection. But that pick now belonged to the Blackhawks, who would use that pick to select Dennis Savard. This is just another example of how making trades could be extremely risky. Now, we haven't seen anything close to this happen from the Vegas draft, and hopefully won't see this with the upcoming Seattle draft, but it truly shows just how important it is to make sure you protect the players you want to keep. It's always fun when any team besides the one you root for completely embarrasses themselves. Just ask me as a Flames fan, it's always funny when the Oilers mess up. And the expansion draft has had many blunders as well. I'm sure you all remember Bill Foley's mistake when they were set to pick from Detroit in the Vegas draft.
Let's get to the next pick of the expansion draft. It will be made from the Detroit Red Wings. And George, you do the honors.
From the Dallas Stars, the Golden Knights select Cody Eakin.
But there's one blunder made by an expansion team that really takes the cake. On June 18th, 1992, the Tampa Bay Lightning and Ottawa Senators were preparing to select the first faces of the franchise, and they knew they had to perform. This was their chance to make a good first impression with the other NHL teams, and Tampa succeeded. Although not putting together the greatest of rosters, everything was arguably going smooth on their end. But as for Ottawa, well, they made a complete fool out of themselves in front of the entire league. The Senators had all their scouting reports stored on a single laptop, so you would think that either Ottawa would A, charge the laptop, or B, bring a backup battery in case of emergency. So what do you think the Senators decided to do? If you answered nothing, you're correct, because midway throughout the 1992 expansion draft, the Senators' laptop died with no backup battery to be found, leaving the Senators to play a complete guessing game. The chaos began when Ottawa selected Todd Ewan from Montreal, as Ewan was no longer available since Montreal already lost 2 players, causing Sens GM Mel Bridgman to infamously say, "Ottawa apologizes." Moments later, they selected Todd Hawkins from Toronto, who was also not eligible due to the same reasoning as Montreal. Ottawa again apologized and then would try to select CJ Young, but the league would have to inform them that Young wasn't even on the eligible players list at all, making them once again apologize. All credibility Ottawa had died, just like their laptop, and they paid the price. Just 3 years after that disastrous expansion draft, not a single player who was chosen would still be on the roster. And as for Mel Bridgman, he would be fired a year into his tenure. We may never see a moment this embarrassing happen to an entire team ever again, but to the players, well, let's rewind to 1967. 1967 was the first ever huge NHL expansion, as the league would double in size from 6 to 12. It was historic, and some legendary names were left unprotected. The first 2 picks for every new team had to be a goaltender, and with the 6 original teams only protecting 1 netminder, it opened the door for a lot of talented netminders to be left unprotected. The Blues with the 3rd pick snagged Glenn Hall from Chicago, and Philly selected Bernie Perron with pick number 2. But the first pick in the expansion draft belonged to the LA Kings, and it stirred some controversy, as before the expansion draft even began, a Maple Leafs player would pull an Eric Lindros, insisting he wouldn't play for any expansion team. That player was Terry Sawchuk, and he would go as far as threatening to retire altogether if he was even chosen by another team. So the LA Kings most likely knew the risk of taking Sawchuk and probably should have stayed clear, right? Nope. The Kings essentially told Terry to suck it up, as they would use the first overall pick to bring Sawchuk over from Toronto. And what do you know, Sawchuk didn't actually retire, and actually suited up for the LA Kings for the entire 67-68 season. He would eventually be traded back to Detroit and later New York before retiring, but Sawchuk's threats were laughable to LA, and it made for some pretty good headlines. We're gonna finish the video going over one expansion draft in particular, as it was so strange that it may seem hard to explain. In spring of 1990, it was evident that the Gunn brothers, the owner of the Minnesota North Stars, had no intention of keeping the team in Minnesota. In fact, they wanted to head over to California and move the team to San Jose, but the NHL said no, and instead of having to face a potential lawsuit, the league struck a deal with the brothers that ended up winning them over. The NHL would grant them a new expansion team in San Jose in exchange for the brothers selling the North Stars to former Whalers owner Harold Baldwin. But what happened next was just flat out crazy. In order to compromise, the new franchise in San Jose was able to take over the contracts of a ton of North Stars players in something they called a disposal draft. The North Stars were able to protect 14 players, and 30 players from the team would head to San Jose. Now, because of this, the North Stars would barely have a roster, which now meant that they would have to participate with the new San Jose franchise in the expansion draft. Yeah. an existing team would pick players in an expansion draft. That's super weird. Both the Sharks and North Stars would pick 10 players each, and once a team lost a player, no one else was able to be selected from that same team. Once the expansion draft was over, the season began, and the North Stars still remained competitive, but the Sharks completely stunk it up. 2 years after the wonky draft, the North Stars were finally on the move, as they would head to Dallas, and Minnesota wouldn't see hockey again until 2000. The final story in today's video is actually one from the same exact expansion draft, and it once again involves Minnesota. As both teams picked their players, less and less teams would remain to choose from, and the North Stars, with the last pick, were stuck picking from the pitiful Quebec Nordiques. Since there was little to no talent on the team, they thought no one available was even worth picking, so much so that they decided to simply select Guy Lafleur. But one little problem. Lafleur was already preparing to retire and was 3 years removed from being inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. Not to mention that Guy was set to become a member of the Nordiques front office, so it was bizarre that a move like this would even occur. Apparently, Minnesota wanted Alan Hallworth from Quebec, but since Alan didn't play for Quebec in a few years, he was considered a defected player and wasn't eligible to be picked. So to resolve the issue at hand, once the expansion draft was complete, the Nordiques would trade Hallworth to Minnesota for Lafleur, allowing Guy to retire and join the front office. With the Seattle draft being tomorrow, a lot of us expect some strange moments to occur, but definitely not as strange as the ones in today's video. But if this video can teach us anything, it's that the NHL is always unpredictable, and all it takes is one deal, contract, or player left unprotected to change the course of the draft and transform a franchise.